Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. As always, I cannot wait to introduce our guest to you. But before we do, I want to thank some people that we always thank. We want to thank brassandwinds.com. We always thank brassandwinds.com because when we're looking for instruments for our school here at the Willow School, they are the people to whom we turn. brassandwinds.com. You're watching Truer MU, The Truth About Music. We do hope you will subscribe to our channel and will like what you see, if you like what you see. We do try to go deeper than some of the other channels when it comes to talking about music. And in that vein, I'd like to talk about our guest today. I have always been a fan of Elvis Costello and the Attractions. And until recently, I didn't realize to what extent I was a fan of just the Attractions. I've had the opportunity to reach Mr. Bruce Thomas, who is the bass player. Let me tell you a little bit about him if you don't already know. Bruce Thomas is probably best known as the bass player with Elvis Costello and the Attractions, with whom he recorded and performed with for the best part of 20 years, and with whom he was inducted into the U.S. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2003. As a session musician, he's worked on both sides of the Atlantic with artists like Sir Paul McCartney and Suzanne Vega, as well as Billy Bragg, Tasman Archer, The Pretenders, and Madness, amongst many others. He is also the author of many books, including Rough Notes, The Big Wheel, about his work as a musician, and Fighting Spirit, the definitive biography of martial artist Bruce Lee. Bruce Thomas, welcome to our show.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you, too. I want to let the audience know that there are lots of interviews with you out there, and we're not going to be duplicating those. So if you don't hear the answer to your favorite question on this one, it's because, for instance, I heard answers already to these questions on the Caro Pop interview or the Open Culture interview. So we're going to be trying to steer away from what you've already said and kind of move into some deeper or unexplored territory. Sound good?
Well, that's a good move for getting your interview shared by me as well, then.
Not at all. I'm not worried about sharing the light there. My first question is that you've described the tedium and the thrill of life as a touring musician. Now, did you have any idea what it would be like when you were just getting in?
I had a kind of gentle, obviously you don't go straight to jets and stadium tours, so it's like, when I started, it was just sitting in a van with all the equipment for 3 hours bouncing along the freeway, and you gradually, then it kind of gets easier, if anything, when you get a seat on a plane or your own room. So then kind of, I guess, after doing it for a couple of decades, it starts to get a bit tedious.
Well, I mean, if you had known of course, the highs are really, really high. You've got the Hall of Fame and you've got all these wonderful records, but the lows apparently are really low. Would you do it all again if you had a chance to choose it?
Well, I guess nothing surprised me about it anyway, because, the life of a musician at various levels, unsuccessful, moderately successful, or very successful, is pretty well, you can pretty well figure out what it's going to be like. I guess the experience is, of course, a lot different, but it's, I didn't get any horrendous shocks. In fact, I got as many pleasant surprises in a way. I mean, people were paying me to go around the world, and not have to get up for work at 9:30 every day and go to an office. So, I wouldn't complain about that ever. And I probably would make a similar choice again. Yeah. I mean, it's, I wouldn't say, knowing what I know now, I'd never go near it. Yeah, I would. Yeah, I'd do it. Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, I guess I'd do it too. I've been listening to Elvis Costello since I was in college. My first exposure was Napoleon Dynamite. That was my first record. That's the one that got me hooked. And I definitely felt like something had been missing in my life up to that point. I've listened to those records and to the other records by Elvis Costello all of my life, but this is the first time I've had a chance to actually listen to the Attractions records just with the bass in mind. It's been really fascinating. And I'm not a bass player, but as a jazz pianist, I have had a chance to be the bass player on numerous occasions. So I haven't, an affinity for or sympathy.
You mean with left hand on the keyboards kind of thing?
Exactly. I've had to be the bass player in that way. So I don't know a lot about the technical of bass, but I do know what the role of the bass player is.
Well, you understand counterpoint and improvisation to a degree, so you probably appreciate, with being not being modest, you'd probably appreciate what I try and do then. In terms of counterpoint and melodic content and stuff.
Yes, in fact, that was one of the joys of this discovery period, was really just paying close attention to what you were actually doing, because a lot of it affected me over the years, but I hadn't really recognized what was causing that sense of joy.
Right. Oh well, joy. I'm happy with that.
Yeah. Let's start with the song "Like the Beat," which is a pretty typical good song. Early Attractions, used your first record.
Yeah.
And in that song, I hear you doing lots of different things. I hear you sometimes following the vocalist, like following the melody of the vocalist, sometimes following the keyboardist, sometimes you're with the drums, and then sometimes you're kind of doing your own thing. Sometimes you're doing just a groove. It's amazing how many different things you do in one track.
Yeah, I do pay a lot of attention to the vocal melody when I'm constructing a part. I have this theory that the role of the bass is not to tie the drums to the instruments, it's to tie the drums to the voice, which is the very bottom and the very top. So the bass drum and the vocal melody, where I take my cues. So you're right to that extent, but I do. You see, look, not to put this as kindly as possible. Elvis wasn't the world's greatest guitarist, and he never attempted to play guitar solos in the early days. In fact, he didn't even want them. So it left me a lot of space to create lines, in the same way that John Entwistle kind of played lead bass over Pete Townshend's power chords.
Yeah.
Who had a lead drummer as well.
Right.
They had a lead bass player, lead drummer, and a very loud rhythm guitarist. And I guess I just stepped in and thought, right, I'm gonna take this spot, and luckily, the keyboards kind of work round the bass as much as anything,
Yeah. One thing a lot of people don't know about bass players is they're as often as not keeping the time and letting the drummers set a mood rather than the other way around. But in the case of the Attractions, it feels like all of you really know the time and no one has to set the time.
Yeah, we're pretty good on that, but I would say the most important ability of the bass player is to be able to play on the note, not drag, not rush. You've got to have a pretty impeccable sense of time, and there can't be any kind of hesitation or anticipation or anything. It's got to be right on. There are Doc Dunn, who played on all the soul records of Stax, is the role model for that. I mean, he never puts a foot wrong. But I watched a program the other evening of classical musicians playing old soul songs at the Albert Hall, doing it all from the music, and the bass player was reading the parts, but he was playing them with such precise timing, it actually grooves. The groove comes from the timing.
That's a relief, because sometimes those classical musicians don't understand what kind of energy is needed for a song like that.
Yeah. To be fair, I think the core of the ensemble on stage, although it was a full orchestra, I think the bass, drums, and guitar and keyboards were kind of regular band musicians, and then all the horns and strings and everything else were the orchestra.
Yeah.
Because I think that I got a feeling that the drummer was and certainly an orchestral drummer wouldn't have been able to play those drums. And I got the feeling the bass player was probably I didn't recognise him, but I think he was a regular session guy. But he was playing it in, if you listen to other bands that kind of rock at state, are you familiar with Status Quo?
I'm not.
Band? No, okay. Well, they're if you check them out, they're a band that they're a bit like the Cheap Trick or the Foo Fighters. They're a heavy-ish metal pop band, and they kind of drive the music. The drummer is playing really square, dead on the, refusing to be dragged into the excitement, as it were, and keeping it all on course.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest lesson you could give a bass player is to just play eight notes to the bar, dead in, and then stop the metronome, then start it a minute later and see if they're still in time.
Wow. Now, I was delighted to find out that you played on the Pretenders track, My Baby, which has always been one of my very favorite Pretenders tracks, and now I know why. But that is a startling contrast to what you do in the Attractions, because Christine Hine...
Well, it is, and not only does the story goes with that track, because I was playing like I normally do with the Attractions, and Chrissy Hine came over to me and said, "What exactly are you doing there?" And I showed her this, this melodic run and all the rest of it. And she said to me, "You'll be doing yourself a big favour if you don't go any higher than the second dot, which is, 5 frets." So I kind of reined it all in, and then at the end of the day I said, "I don't think you need me. I think you need something like you're more used to." So that was my sole contribution to the album, although it did turn out to be a hit record. So
Yeah, I want
to... The single, it turned out to be a hit single, so...
It's not just a hit, it really is a beautiful track, and your bass playing is part of that.
Well, I tried to play like her, her old bass player did, just keep it rooted.
Yeah, I was going to say, you had your arm tied behind your back. How did you go into that? I guess you said you tried to sound like her other bass player, but
she gave me the instructions. Don't go higher than the 5th fret, so I didn't.
Right. But so what did that leave you with?
It left me with just playing parts down, low in the low register, simple parts. And to be honest, I think what I did worked, and it probably worked better than what I was attempting to do.
Yeah.
It was certainly probably a bit too much for her taste, anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
Talk about the balance in your approach. You use words like counterpoint. You've talked about Bach and arpeggios in your interviews. In your brain, how much of what you're doing is thinking about theory versus just using your ear and your gut? And has that changed over the years?
I learned music theory after I learned how to play music. I realised why a 7th was called a 7th after being playing for about 10 years.
Yeah.
And I use my ear and my instinct. I basically played the parts I heard in my in my mind's ear, if you like. I often used to sing a part and then play it. I could sing the melody of the part I wanted to play.
Yeah.
I don't know a whole lot about music theory. Certainly not. I wish I had the musical sophistication of someone like Donald Fagen, of Steely Dan, whose chord inversions and things like that, and what they altered chords are actually things of beauty. They're astonishing, but I have no idea how they're constructed.
Huh.
I know I like listening to them, and the same with, I once made a fairly good attempt at learning a Bach fugue, but by the time I'd kind of figured out how to read the music, I'd learnt it by heart anyway.
Yeah.
And it's really kind of just arpeggiating and inverting, isn't it? Inverting arpeggios and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Bass parts. So you're just using roots, thirds, and fifths in various combinations, so they flow together. That's the best way I can explain it.
Right.
And that's kind of what I do.
Yeah, and of course the same sense of, filling the hole, making sure you're not getting in anything. It's the parts getting out of their way, but making sure they fill each other's, empty spaces.
You've got to, the first thing, you've got to support the song before you start showing off,
Yeah. And that's hard if you want to get the gig, right?
if there's room to do, I always try to do something new, something different, and come up with a part that wasn't just formulaic,
Yeah. You've talked about a lot of bass players who are your favorites. You mentioned Donald Duck Dunn, John Entwistle, Paul McCartney, of course, whose destiny is entwined with yours, and James Jamerson and Jaco Pastorius. Yeah. One of my favorite bass players who you hardly mention at all is John Paul Jones. And
oh yeah, he's great. Yeah, he's. I have to say he's overlooked.
Yeah.
A little bit, but he is good. Yeah, he's more important to that band than is than is often given credit for.
Yeah, can I give?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, he was a pretty. He was probably the one of the most 2 or 3 important session bass players in the UK.
Yeah. I think he taught me a very valuable lesson about bass before I started listening to you. Was that I listened to the song "Ramble On," and one day I realized that that's nothing but the bass. There is no song without the bass to that song.
Yeah, there's a couple of songs like that.
Yeah.
2 or 3. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So Elvis Costello is one of my favorite performers and songwriters. But again, until I started really paying attention for this interview, I hadn't really thought so much about the band and his relationship to the band. And I'm still working on clarity on that. Can you give me a sense of where Elvis Costello ends and the Attractions begin?
He would basically come to us with a song which is possibly strummed on, basic chords on the guitar, singing the words and the melody, and we pretty much did in rehearsals head arrangements between the 4 of us. So Steve would work out his keyboard part, Pete would work out his drum part, I'd work out the bass part, and of course there wouldn't be a great deal of a guitar part to work out. So that was pretty much it. But certainly it was, in terms of, once the basic chords and melody and words were there, it was basically a 4-way collaboration. Elvis didn't come to us and say, "Can you play this? Can you play that? Can you do? You do this, you do that." We just got on with it.
So one thing I haven't heard in interviews about this is really some of the details of that. I mean, were y'all like a married couple where you finished each other's sentences and you didn't have to talk a lot, or were there arguments and kind of working stuff out vocally?
Probably all of that.
Yeah.
But we were pretty quick. We were pretty. Steve was a trained musician anyway. I'd been playing professionally for 10 years before the Attractions, Pete, more or less. So we weren't sort of coming to it raw. We'd done,
right.
What's the word? We'd learned our chops.
Like a second or a third marriage for most of you.
Well, everybody just, you would join a band for 2 years, and if they didn't make it, you'd go on to another band,
Yeah. Actually,
till you did.
That's a question I have for you, because, I mean, the Attractions are remarkable. Lots of bands play together for years, and many of them have really great people in them, but very few do what the Attractions did. And I do think the Attractions are highly underrated for this reason. But what do you think made it possible for the Attractions really to go farther and be one of the best bands in the world? Luck?
you're gonna get into cliches like the chemistry and all that stuff, but I mean, I think that it's just timing, you know. I mean, I went, you know, if you listen to this year's model, I sometimes think, where did all that bass playing come from? You see, I would, Suzanne Vega once said quite a good thing. She said, you just wait for the well to fill up and then, you know, then he goes. So I think it had all been kind of building up inside. You know, I mean, Elvis was performing and in bands that weren't getting anywhere, particularly. You know, and he probably thought, same as me, same with Pete and Steve. Well, he was just straight out of college, but I think it was just like, whoosh, yeah, we were all ready for it, you know.
Yeah.
And right place, right time, I guess.
Right. And well, chemistry may be a cliche, but I mean, it's certainly true.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever, you know, arguments you have to be able to weather them and live with a certain amount of tension in the relationship to make that tension hold together in the music.
Yeah. Well, it can be quite creative tension, you know. If everybody's just jollying along, it can be pretty feeble.
Right. And you were able to weather a lot of tension in Napoleon Dynamite, apparently, you know.
Well, yeah, I mean, usually gave as good as I got, so.
Of course, yeah. In your book, you talk a lot more about Pete than you talk about Steve, and I'm really curious. He is, in my opinion, just about the best keyboardist I've ever heard on a record. Really, just, you know, miles above everybody else.
An odd dynamic. I mean, Pete was a fan of my previous bands before I joined the Attraction, and Pete Thomas went a long way towards persuading Elvis to take me on as the bass player, you know.
Right.
So, but with Steve, funny thing happened once. We were outside a hotel and in New York, and we both got our respective wives, and one of them said, started to introduce us, said, "Oh, Bruce, this is Steve," because we were both kind of, we didn't, you know, we walked up together, but we were both kind of staring at our feet and waiting for the women to finish talking, and they introduced us as if we'd never met.
Yeah.
You know, and I thought that was quite a telling. He said, "Oh God, you're in the same band, but it feels like you don't know each other."
Ah. Yeah, it's amazing because you don't play like that. I mean, your bass and his keyboards mesh beautifully. But
yeah.
But personality-wise, you didn't talk much.
Yeah, I didn't dislike him. I found it. I guess we weren't just natural, whatever it is.
Yeah.
You know, natural bodies.
Right.
Types. You know. But it got better. You know.
Yeah.
Later on, kind of it opened out, you know.
Sure. I would like to go back to the bass. I was curious about what you had to get better at when you were learning bass and what you were naturally good at. And, you know, in that vein, what's something that is really not in your wheelhouse that you really would say, oh.
Something that I was good at was timing and riffing, you know,
yeah.
R&B, that R&B soul. The stuff that I had to get good at was that when I started, I could play along with Otis Redding and Booker T and all that stuff, but I couldn't play along with James Jamerson or Paul McCartney because there were too many chords and the lines were too musical. So it took me a while before I got that ability, you know, installed.
Yeah.
So I couldn't attempt to play a song with lots of chord changes. It'd have to be a kind of 1-4-5.
But
you know.
But Elvis's tunes have lots of chord changes. They're crazy.
He did, but by that time I'd kind of got better doing. You know, I did session work with the likes of Al Stewart and things like that, and they had more more songy songs. You know, I did quite a lot of folky sessions back in the day,
Yeah.
and the Sutherland brothers wrote songs with more chords in. So I gradually learnt the vocabulary, as it were.
Well, what about now? Is there any job you wouldn't take just because it's just not? I can't do it.
Yeah, probably if Donald Fagen asked me to join the Steely Dan, I'd say, listen, I could come all the way to New York and start rehearsing with you, only to be fired within half an hour.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because in your interview with Mark Linsenmeyer, you described Steely Dan as readers, implying that you don't read music. Is that true? You don't read music?
No, I don't know.
Well,
I've tried many times to learn, but I just play it quicker by ear.
Okay, yeah, I have to ask you because you spent 8 or 9 hours a day learning the bass, and then we're going to talk a little later about martial arts. You spent 8 or 9 hours a day with martial arts. That's what you got to do with reading. Well, why didn't you do that with reading?
I guess attention is what's the word? Necessity is the mother of attention.
Invention.
And I didn't need to read to get a job. Otherwise, I might be playing in an orchestra pit now.
Yeah.
You know, with all the readers. So, yeah. And then, of course, you're playing somebody else's stuff as well, and I like making my own stuff up.
Sure.
But as regards the 8 or 9 hours thing, I mean, I'm a great believer in the 10,000 hours theory, that you need to spend 10,000 hours doing something in order to become proficient at it.
Yeah.